I wrote, "Wood, 5 sticks in, 1 small pile out," and the pencil felt heavier than the axe. By 3:40, the door latch would not lift, and my grandson's cough sounded too close in the dark. So I scored a shovel line on the tunnel wall to measure how fast the drift was climbing. If the stove went quiet before dawn, there would be nothing left to bargain with but breath. February 1879. Minnesota frontier country, a few miles out from the small town of Ash Creek. The sky had been the same color for 3 days, like tin left in snow. Our cabin sat low in the drift, the roofline softened and blurred. Wind came steady from the northwest and never seemed to tire. I kept the lamp turned down to save kerosene. I kept the stove alive with small sticks instead of big logs. My name is Eliza Rowan. I was 67 that winter. The boy with me was my grandson, Jacob, 8 years old, thin as a fence rail, quick to watch my hands. If the drifts sealed us in again, and I could not reach wood, the stove would die, the cabin would turn to ice, and the child would cough until it became something worse. Before dawn, the first signal was plain. The door latch would not lift. Snow had packed the jam so tight the iron felt welded. On the inside boards, a faint white line of frost traced the cracks like chalk. I put my knife blade to the seam, and it came back wet, then froze. I wrote one line in my ration ledger by lamplight. Wood, 5 sticks in, 1 small pile out. Flour, 9 suppers if level. Kerosene, 2 fingers in the bottle. Those were my measurements, and they were the only honest clock I owned. Jacob's mother was gone from us, and my daughter had walked east the previous spring with a traveling man and a promise that did not come back. Jacob's father had been taken 2 winters earlier, fever in his lungs after a fall from a wagon tongue. That left the boy in my keeping. It also left my hands as the only hands between him and the weather. At 3:40, with the stove mostly coals, I set my shoulder to the door. The planks flexed once and did not move. Jacob stood behind me in his wool shirt, coughing once into his sleeve, then waiting to see whether I would name it. I did not name it. I only held up 2 fingers so he would stay quiet, so I could listen. Outside, the wind made a steady scraping sound, like sand poured against boards. After 6 short breaths, I spoke one medium sentence to myself. If the front door was a trap now, and we needed another way out that the wind could not own. The cabin was 1 room with a lean-to pantry and a trap door to a small root cellar beneath. The cellar had been dug when my husband still lived, its walls lined with oak slabs and clay, its ceiling braced with cedar poles. In winter, earth holds still air. Earth does not blow away. I lit the lamp a touch brighter and checked the stove. The flue pipe ran to the wall and up, patched twice with flattened tin and stove cement I had traded for in Ash Creek. A small paper was tacked behind the stove, a repair note in my own hand. January 22nd, sealed elbow joint, 9:10 p.m. February 3rd, re-cemented seam, 6:30 a.m. I read the last line and touched the seam again. It held, but it smelled faintly of smoke, which meant nothing could be taken for granted. By first light, and the window was a pale square, I boiled a spoon of oats in water melted from clean snow. I cut the portion into 2 bowls and made mine smaller without ceremony. After breakfast, I laid out the tools on the table. A hand saw, my axe, a brace and bit, a hammer, nails, and a wedge of candle to slick the saw. Then I marked a rectangle on the side wall to the right of the stove, where boards were thinner and the drift hit less hard, wide enough for my shoulders, tall enough for Jacob to crawl. At midday, the wind eased for a half hour. That was my window. I drilled the first holes. Wood chips fell like pale curls onto the floor. Jacob held the lamp and counted under his breath. "What are you counting?" I asked. "The strokes," he said, "so I don't think about the wind." After 8 short lines of work, my medium line was simple. I would rather spend nails on an exit than spend Jacob's breath on prayer. The saw started slow. I stopped to wipe it with candle. The first board came loose with a sigh. Cold air pushed in like a hand. I did not leave the hole open. I had boards ready, planks pulled from a spare shelf, and I nailed them as a frame. Then I hung a narrow panel on leather straps for hinges, because iron hinges were for the front door, and we had only one. The panel swung. It did not seal. So I packed cloth along the edge and tacked it down. I cut a strip from an old flour sack, the one stamped Ash Creek Mill, number 2, Spring. The stamp was still readable, and that mattered. If you can read the stamp, you know what you truly have. By late afternoon, I tried the side door. It opened into packed snow, thinner than the front, but still a wall. I took the shovel and began to cut. I did not dig a path to open air. That would invite the wind to race in and steal heat. Instead, I dug a short snow tunnel, just long enough to reach beyond the cabin's lee. I packed the walls with the shovel blade. I pressed them firm with mittened palms. Snow can be a blanket if you make it behave. At 5:20, the the first consequence came. A gust hit the cabin broadside, and the new panel rattled hard enough to shake nails. Jacob startled. I drove 2 more nails into the frame while the wind was still punching. That evening, I wrote a proof line in the ledger. February 9th, cut side exit, 5:20 p.m., panel rattled. Under it, I wrote, nails used, 14. By 9:10, the storm tightened. The window went white. I fed the stove 1 stick at a time as I set the kettle so it would catch heat and keep the air wet enough to breathe. Jacob's cough returned at 10:30, just twice. Not deep, but warning. I warmed a cloth and held it to his chest under his shirt. No cures promised, only warmth and time. Before midnight, I took the shovel into the tunnel and scored a clean line on the packed wall. Here, I said to Jacob, this is tonight's drift. If it climbs past that by morning, we know how hard it worked. At 12:40 a.m., the cabin creaked under the roof load. I tapped rafters with the broom handle and listened. No cracking. Still, I did not sleep deep. At 2:15, I woke to a change in the stove's voice. The draft had slowed. A thin thread of soot had traced down the pipe. A bad draft can turn a cabin into a coffin. After 8 short actions, my medium sentence was a decision. We would use the earth tonight, not as storage, but as shelter. I guided Jacob into the root cellar with the lantern. We carried quilts and a sack of kindling to keep the air from feeling empty. The cellar held stillness. Jacob whispered, "It smells like dirt." "It smells like safety," I told him. At 4:50, I climbed up to check the cabin. The stove had held to coals. I fed it 1 stick. Then I called Jacob up. His eyes looked clearer in the weak light. By first light, I pushed into the tunnel and reached the drift mark. The snow had climbed 2 fingers above the line I scored at midnight. I cut a new line above it. "Overnight," I said aloud. Jacob watched. "That's higher," he said. "Yes," I answered, "and now we know how fast it moves." At 7:20, I forced the tunnel open to the outside pocket. In that lee, I could stand, and I could see the woodpile under canvas 10 paces away. 10 paces might as well be a mile when wind is a blade. I wrapped a rope around my waist and fixed the other end to the table leg. A rope is a promise you can feel when your eyes lie. At 7:45, I crawled out. I stayed low. I reached the woodpile and found the canvas stiff with ice. The knots were frozen, so I worked them with my teeth and the edge of my knife. I dragged 2 split logs and a bundle of kindling back to the tunnel mouth. Once inside, I closed the panel and packed snow against it from the inside, sealing the gaps. My shoulders shook from cold strain. Jacob's eyes widened at the logs. "You did it," he said. "I did the part that mattered," I replied. I wrote the next proof line. February 10th, wood recovered via tunnel. 8:10 a.m. Then I added, "and rope tied to table leg." I did not let that first success fool me. A tunnel can save you once and kill you the second time if you get careless. At 9:55, I crawled back in with the shovel and cleaned the floor of the tunnel. My boots had scraped loose snow into ridges. Loose snow turns to ice when you breathe on it. Ice turns to a slide when you hurry. I cut the ridges flat and packed the base firm. Then I made the tunnel bend. Not much, just a slight dog leg, so the wind could not see straight through to the cabin. I carved the turn with the shovel edge and pressed the corner tight with my forearms. Snow holds shape when you treat it like clay. Jacob watched from the panel, eyes bright with the idea of it. "Like making a hallway," he said. "Like making a wall?" I answered. "A hallway lets wind run, and a wall makes it slow down." At 11:20, I hung a second cloth flap inside the panel, a curtain of sackcloth and blanket scrap. 2 layers, one to stop wind, one to trap warm air behind it. I tacked it high and left it loose at the bottom so it could fall back into place. That was another consequence beat you could see on screen. The curtain moved with every gust. If it moved fast, we knew the outside pressure was climbing. If it hardly moved, we knew we had bought ourselves a little quiet. I wrote it in the ledger anyway. February 10th, inner flap hung. 11:20 a.m. Purpose, slow wind. At noon, the sky stayed white, but the light changed, thinner and more open. I stepped into the tunnel and listened. When storms are deep, you hear nothing. When they loosen, you hear the world again, in small pieces. A raven called somewhere far off, but it sounded like a nail dragged on iron. Jacob smiled at the sound like it was a visitor. At 12:45, I set a temperature check the only way I could. I hung a tin spoon on a string near the wall seam and watched how quickly frost formed on it. When frost came fast, we were losing heat. When it came slow, the stove was winning. By that spoon, the cabin was on the edge. So I rationed tighter. 1 stick every 40 minutes. No more. If I gave in and fed it heavy now, we would pay at 3 o'clock with cold hands and no fuel. At 1:30, Jacob's left boot split at the toe seam. The leather had been soaked too many times, dried too fast by the stove, and cracked like old bark. He tried to hide it by standing with his foot under the table. I saw it anyway. I always see the things children try to hide when they think it will protect you. And I took the boot, warmed the leather by the kettle steam, and stitched it with with waxed thread. I laid a thin scrap of rawhide over the split and laced it tight. Then I counted the stitches out loud so the work stayed steady. 6, 7, 8. When I finished, I wrote the proof detail in my patch book. February 10th. Jacob boot toe, 23 stitches, rawhide overlay. Jacob flexed his foot and nodded. "It feels strong," he said. "It will last," I answered. "Long enough to matter." At 2:55, the wind changed direction for 10 minutes and shoved snow toward the side panel. The flap curtain snapped twice, fast. That told me the tunnel mouth would drift shut if I ignored it. So I crawled out to the pocket and cut a small notch above the tunnel opening, like a vent, so blown snow would skim past instead of pouring in. It was a small shaping, but winter is a game of small shapings. At 3:12, I came back in with my eyelashes frozen. Jacob stared at them. "You look like the fence posts," he said. "Then I'm standing," I told him. At 4:05, I checked the drift mark line again. It had not moved since morning. That meant the storm was holding, not climbing. Holding is still dangerous, but it is predictable. Predictable is something you can work with. By midday, the storm eased just enough for thought. That is when trouble tends to arrive. A knock came at the buried front door. 3 dull thuds, as if the world was tapping on a box. I spoke through the door. "Who is it?" "Tom Sutter," a muffled voice answered. "Neighbor." Sharp tongue. "I saw your smoke," he called. "You got extra flour?" "I have enough to keep a child alive," I said. He snorted. "Heard the stores marking your account again." That was a threat dressed as gossip. "You cut a hole in your house yet?" he added, laughing. Whole town will laugh when they hear. After 10 short lines, my medium sentence carried a boundary. Tell the store I'll answer his paper when roads open. And tell your wife to stop laughing at old people who still build. He laughed once, then left. Jacob watched me like he expected my shoulders to fall. I did not let them. I took my mending notebook, the one where I kept stitch counts. Jacob mittens, 18 stitches, wool patch, the last line read. I added a new one. February 10th, coat cuff restitched, 12 stitches. Proof is not only for merchants. Proof is for the mind when it starts to waver. At 3:20 p.m., the flue draft slowed again, and I pressed stove cement along the seam and held it until it set. On the repair note, I added, February 10th, sealed seam, 3:20 p.m. By evening, the wind rose hard again. The front door became a memory. Our side exit was our only mouth to the world. That night, we ate beans warmed with a shaving of lard. I let Jacob have the larger spoon. I did not call it sacrifice. It was just the math of keeping a child alive. At 1:10, the side panel shuddered under snow pressure. I braced it with a board across the inside and cinched it tight with a leather strap twisted by a stick. Jacob watched, eyes heavy. "That's clever," he murmured. "It's only stubborn," I said. At 3:40, the roof creaked with a deeper groan. I crawled into the tunnel to measure. The drift line had climbed to my new mark. I scored another line and wrote a small 2 beside it with charcoal. By first light, I could feel the storm shifting. Jacob begged to come out with me, so I gave him a job that mattered without risking him. He tied knots on the rope for distance. 1 knot every 3 feet, I instructed. He measured with his own arm span and counted them. 3, 4, 5. At 8:25, I went out again and hauled more wood, arms burning. On the way back, wind shoved me sideways, and the world went white. For a moment, I lost the tunnel mouth. Then the rope knot under my mitten told me I had gone too far. I followed it back, hand over hand, until the opening rose like a small, dark bruise in the snow. Inside, I sat on the floor and let my heart settle. Jacob did not speak. He only handed me the ledger pencil. That midday, and I made our unusual choice plain. I moved our sleeping quilts down into the root cellar and left them there. Not because the cabin was hopeless, but because Earth gave us a second layer of defense. If smoke backed up, if the stove failed, if the roof groaned too deep, we could go down and wait for daylight. Root cellar living was not comfort. It was method. In the ledger, I wrote, "Plan. Sleep in cellar if wind peaks." Then I scratched a mark on the lantern bottle glass to show its level. 1/3. A line you could see. At 12:10, with the wind low, I did what I had been delaying. I began to relieve the front door, not to use it right away, but to stop the drift from pressing the cabin like a vice. I worked in the pocket near the side exit first, then cut a trench along the cabin wall toward the buried entry. Snow that has been wind-packed is like cutting cheese left out overnight. It comes off in slabs. It also fights your shovel and tries to twist your wrists. Jacob stayed inside and kept the stove steady. He fed it by the clock I gave him. Every 40 minutes, I reminded him. He watched the kettle and the flap curtain and learned the weather by watching fabric move. At 1:05, I reached the corner where the front stoop used to be. There was no stoop now, only a smooth white rise. I stabbed the shovel down until it hit wood and felt the hollow sound of the buried steps. Then I carved away enough space to put my hand on the door frame. The snow was higher than my shoulder. I took my knife and nicked the inner frame again, a second measured mark. Then I wrote it in the ledger when I came back inside, breath steaming. On February 12th, front drift, mark updated. 1:40 p.m. Depth, 4 feet at latch. At 2:25, I heard a crack that was not the roof. It was the tunnel. A thin, settling sound. I froze and listened. Snow is quiet when it holds. It makes a small complaint when it shifts. I crawled into the tunnel and ran my palm along the ceiling. It had sagged a finger's width, not collapse. A warning. After 7 short movements, my medium line was calm. Warnings are gifts if you treat them as orders. I took 2 narrow boards from under the bed frame and slid them into the tunnel along the ceiling, like ribs. I jammed them tight against the packed walls and sprinkled loose snow over them, then pressed until it set hard again. A simple shore. Not pretty, but it kept the roof from deciding for us. I wrote that proof detail too. On February 12th, tunnel shored with 2 boards. 2:50 p.m. Then I drew a tiny sketch of the bend, because a sketch saves you when you are tired and forget which way the dog leg turns. At 3:30, the light outside turned thin and blue. That was the day's warning that cold would come back harder at night. So I brought more wood in while I still could. 2 logs, 1 bundle kindling. Then I packed the tunnel mouth with a shaped block of snow, like a plug, leaving only a small crawl gap. Less open space, less wind, more control. Jacob touched the shovel mark lines and the little charcoal numbers. He looked at them the way some boys look at church writing. "Those are our days," he said. "Yes," I told him. "And if anyone ever says we only got lucky, you can show them the marks. Luck doesn't leave measurements." By midday, the storm finally broke into light flurries. The world looked washed, like fresh cloth. We crawled out through the tunnel together for the first time. I made Jacob keep one hand on the rope. He touched the drift mark lines in the tunnel and traced them with a finger. "We made that," he whispered. "We made a rule," I corrected. That afternoon, Tom's voice came again through the front drift. "Heller says your accounts due," he shouted. "He says sheriff notice by month's end." Month's end. As if snow cared about calendars. After 8 short replies, my medium sentence was a promise. "Tell Heller the snow set the terms, and tell him I will pay with work and goods when the road allows it." Tom did not laugh this time. He only said, quieter, "All right." Then he left. That evening, the wind returned with a heavier hand. By 6:10, snow sifted down the chimney outside and made the draft hiccup. I heard it as a tiny cough in the stove. I adjusted the damper and watched the flame take. At 7:30, Jacob's cheeks went pale and his breathing turned shallow with the cold. I warmed water, mixed a spoon of honey from a small crock, and made him sip slow. Not medicine. Moisture. Warmth. Time. At 11:50, a heavy thump hit the roof, a slab of wind-packed snow sliding. The cabin shook. Jacob gasped. I listened. No crack. Still, it reminded me the roof was a task. After 6 short lines, I said 1 medium line for the record. We clear the roof at first light if the wind gives even 20 minutes. At 4:30, I woke to a silence that made my arms prickle. I went to the side exit. I pushed. It held firm. Snow pressure had tightened it, so I dug from inside, shaving the packed wall with the shovel edge until the panel could breathe. At first light, 6:55, I opened the tunnel to the outside pocket. The sky was low gray, but the wind had fallen to a restless breeze. I shoveled a ramp of packed snow along the cabin side and climbed it carefully. From that ramp, I pushed roof snow off in slabs. Chimney breathed easier at once. Stove draft improved. Cabin breathed again. Jacob stood below and watched the slabs fall. Like breaking bread, he said. Exactly, I answered. You break it so it doesn't crush you whole. At 8:40, I nicked the inside door frame with my knife and made a measured mark for drift height. Then I wrote beside it, with charcoal, February 12th, drift to here. In the ledger, I added a line, front drift mark, 3 feet 2 inches. Not perfect, but real enough to guide my hands. Later that day, Tom came to the side lee pocket, hat crusted with ice. He looked at the tunnel and did not smirk. Heller wrote a note, he said, holding it out. I took it with cloth. Payment, or sheriff notice, by February 28th, the paper said. Ink underlined the date like it could thaw roads. I laid it beside my trade chit from Ash Creek Mercantile and wrote the proof line. February 12th, received Heller notice. Then I wrote, weather, roads closed. That night, by lamplight at 9:40, I wrote my reply on the back of an old handbill. Mr. Heller, roads closed by storm, will pay with labor and goods when passable. Do not send sheriff to a sealed cabin. E. Rowan. Exact is better than pretty. 3 days later, when the road packed enough for a sled, Tom carried my note to town. He returned with a new chit, stamped, and signed. A payment deferred until March 15th. Labor accepted. paper bent, finally, the way it sometimes does when winter proves stronger. In my ledger, I wrote, February 15th, Heller deferred. Proof. New chit. Then I added one more line for myself. Tunnel kept the wind out. When the next snow came later that month, I did not wait for the front door to disappear. Before dusk, I checked the side panel. I packed the tunnel walls. I scored a fresh mark. Jacob helped, serious as a man. He did not call it a rabbit hole. He called it our second door. And every time I saw those shovel lines on that packed wall, I remembered this. Winter does not grant mercy. You carve your own small mercies into it, one mark at a time, and you keep a child breathing. If you want more calm frontier stories like this, subscribe and join me again.